So just to see if that tilts.
My name is Roberto Casati, and I'm a senior researcher with the French CNRS. And I'm leading this project on the Burj Khalifa shadow. The project is called Dial. The dial, meaning a sundial, we try to use the Burj Khalifa as the tallest sundial in the world. The idea of this project came when I was living in New York City, and I could see from my window a sea of roofs, and I was following during the day the pattern of light and shadow over those roofs. And at some point I started taking pictures because I wanted to see how the pattern evolved over time. And at some time, still I decided to take pictures by a small experiment by turning the camera so that one side of the frame of the picture was always aligned with one of the shadows that I was following during the day. And I had no particular expectations about the result, but then when I took the whole set of pictures in a sequence and I looked at it as if it was a time lapse, I noticed that there was a strong impression that the shadows were standing still and the landscape was rotating. So the idea came to create a small educational video that could give impression of the spin of the Earth, of the rotation of the Earth. So if we follow the situation during the whole day, it would be possible to have impression that the Earth is spinning around the shadow. And this is an impression that you cannot get normally by just looking around. You need a time lapse to convey this impression. If you picture the situation astronomically, there is an invariant here, which is the Sun-Earth direction, which is a ray of light coming from the Sun. This direction doesn't change. Of course, it changes relative to the stars, but you can imagine it kept constant, and the Earth is spinning relative to that line that connects the Sun to the Earth. So during the day, not only the Earth is rotating relative to that direction, but all objects on the Earth are rotating. And so the shadows, which you are typically looking at as if they were spinning around objects, could also be considered as fixed. So they wouldn't move relative to that direction. They are always aligned with sun rays. And so it is not as if shadows are spinning around objects. It is exactly the opposite. Objects are spinning around shadows. And thus, it would be possible to follow this movement during the day in order to convey the impression that the Earth is spinning. There is a missing element here, and the missing element is why should we prefer the spin of the Earth, the spin of the whole environmental situation to the movement of a shadow? There is no way to choose between those in ordinary perception. Either is good in the sense that they are so slow that they go completely unnoticed. So it's a very slow movement, and it is impossible to track it in ordinary perception. So we are using here two further elements. One element is the fact that in perception, objects move relative to other objects in a way which depends on the way perception fixes a frame of reference. And typically it is larger objects that fix a frame of reference, or objects which are aligned with the frame of the image that fix the frame of reference. And the second element that we use is acceleration. It is the fact that we employ the time lapse, the accelerated movie, to make it visible what is not possible to see with the capability of ordinary perception of tracking movement. So the whole project is about finding an appropriate frame of reference to make it possible for visual perception to detect the Earth's spin. Now, if you want to follow the movement of a shadow during the day, you have a specific engineering task, a challenge. That is you have to mount the camera on an engine that spins, at the same rate as the Earth rotation. And it also has to be always aligned with the tip of a shadow. And the idea here is to use an astronomic software that allows you to point to the anti-solar point. That is the point which is opposite to you relative to the sun. And intuitively, it is the point in the visual image that corresponds to the shadow of your head. The sun is behind you, and the sun rays are intercepted by your head, and they cast a shadow, and this shadow corresponds to the anti-solar point. So the specification for the engineering team is to have the camera always pointing to the anti-solar point. So the camera takes a shot and moves a bit, and then takes another shot and moves a bit, and then takes another shot and moves a bit during the day. And then you take all these shots and mount them in a single accelerated movie, which is the movie that you will see in this project. The counterintuitive part of the project is this. You have to consider the shadow as fixed. So the shadow is visually fixed and everything else moves. It is the only fixed element in the scene and everything else is moving. And so if the visual system is persuaded to accept this fact, that the shadow is not moving, and this is part of this framing project, then something else will be seen as moving. Perception of movement is typically perception of relative movement. So you perceive something moving relative to something else. And we know this for a number, because of a number of visual illusions. And the most important is the train illusion. So you're sitting in a train, and you have impression that the train in front of you is moving, but actually it is your train that is moving. There are many other cases in visual perception in which something is taken as a frame of reference. There are illusions of slant of surfaces. Water surfaces can be seen as slanted, as in the Fontaine Médicis in Paris, because the whole frame of references has been tilted. And it looks as if the water surface is going down, where, of course, it has to be perfectly flat. So perception of movement is part of a class of perceptual phenomena which construe one situation as changing relative to another situation. And this second situation is taken as fixed. Another good examples are pictures of San Francisco street that are very much slanted, but if you frame in such a way that cars are taken parallel to the frame of a picture, it looks as if houses are slanted now. So in our project, the frame of reference is constituted by the camera's frame. And the camera is like a window on the world, and as any other window, it has sides. And the camera is seen as not moving here, and it generates the illusion of the movement of the things that are framed in the camera, although the camera is moving. But well, actually, the camera is not moving, so this is not an illusion, because the camera is not moving relative to the sun-Earth direction. And so I hesitate calling this an illusion. We are just exploiting some basic facts about visual perception in order to convey an impression. So basically, every object could provide this illusion of movement. Of course, the larger the environment, which is taken in the picture, the stronger the illusion that the movement is the movement of the Earth. So when I was in New York, I was looking for a location, and the ideal location would be a skyscraper, possibly one of those skyscrapers that are facing Central Park South. But the research didn't prove to be conclusive. It was too complicated to get permissions, and nobody wanted me to be on the top of one of those beautiful apartments, and so on and so forth. I also created a number of software simulations and real models, 3D models, concrete models, to get an idea of the position of a shadow during different moments of the day, different periods of the year. I also tried some real-size experiments. So I happened to live in a skyscraper in Paris, so I went to the top of the skyscraper, got permissions, and took a time-lapse of the movement of a shadow of a skyscraper during a beautiful day at the beginning of the fall. So it was a fall equinox, and at the fall equinox, at the equinoxes, the tip of the shadows has the interesting property of moving exactly in a precise straight line. after this preliminary analysis, it turns out that the main challenge of the project is to have a tall enough building in an area which has no competitors, so that the shadow is not disturbed in its path when it goes over the landscape that we are shooting the movie of. At that point, I had a conversation with designer Goffredo Puccetti of NYU Abu Dhabi, with whom I'm collaborating on a design watch and other projects. And he was in the position to contact the management of Burj Khalifa in order to get permission to use the highest terraces on the tower to shoot our movie. So Burj Khalifa is a masterpiece of design and architecture, but in our project it becomes a scientific instrument. We are using this architectural landmark as a scientific instrument, and we use it as a sundial for a pedagogical project.
My name is Goffredo Puccetti. I'm assistant professor of practice of visual arts at New York University, Abu Dhabi. And I'm a designer, I'm a visual designer, and I've had this long conversation about visual design with the philosopher Roberto Casati. And it was more or less almost done with the project. It was just, finalizing the exact location in New York. And I remember at the time I was already here in Abu Dhabi and in conversation with friends and people in Dubai, and I happened to have one contact at the Dubai Mall, which happened to be owned by Emaar, this huge conglomerate, this huge enterprise that actually also owns the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. So I said, Roberto, hold on a second. Let's see if maybe we can get access to not just a cooler location, but the perfect location. Yeah, so a terrace that is maybe conceived for just providing guests of a high floor restaurant, beautiful view on Dubai, might become the platform for a scientific experiment, designed by a philosopher, implemented by a designer, carried on by engineers. This is the most fascinating aspect of this project. For example, you can imagine when they set up for the end-of-year fireworks display, that means they close the terraces from a certain point to a certain point. So actually to find the right moment for us was a little bit of a challenge, but that happened. So as a designer, I'm really interested in the opportunity of explaining things, showing things. We are visual mammals. You can talk about the visual, the earth rotation, but then, okay, here you go, just a few seconds. See the shadow? It's stationary. You see the planet? It's revolving.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Karau, and I'm the director of the engineering design studio here at NYU Abu Dhabi. And we're a space that's open 24 hours a day for students to come in and do projects that otherwise would be impossible to do. And so we take projects that would be opportunities students encounter and require either funds or support beyond what class projects would entail, and meet those students at that kind of extreme possibility with extreme support. And so in the case of this project on the Burj, we've taken a couple of students who spend time in our lab, who had, I would say, a little bit of extra time, and pushed them to take the project on themselves and grow with the project some either new techniques for their own way of working, or in fact create brand new things in order to empower this project to happen. It was like going to outer space, I have to say. It really felt like, when we were up there, it felt like being in outer space, because you're so far away from everything. You go up an elevator for some minutes, you take a series of ladders up to a space that has access to nothing, and if you forgot something, you simply don't have it. You simply don't have it. And this is the piece of the puzzle for us, that when you're up there, everything also is like being on a spacewalk. That if you have a screwdriver, it must be tethered to you in some way. If you have anything, there's a belt that has the tool on it. You don't have any loose tools. You don't have any loose anything, because every loose thing is a possible falling object. And so it became really like a completely new world when you're up there. There's an educational outcome here. There's a technical challenge, and then there's the surrounding set of challenges of being at height, working with things hanging over the edge, 700 meters above tourists, and looking down and saying, if a rubber band falls, it's too much, And so every single element of that process being managed, and so the production and planning for that were just something that is new for most of us to say. Working at those levels and those levels of safety are really something you take to heart very differently than standing on solid ground. And
so with the addition of an external hardware and a software that was connected to a computer inside the Burj Khalifa, we're able to make this proprietary, very available rig that was purchased from the market to actually perform the particular function of rotating a camera over the course of a day that we were looking for. Because this was a very available and cheap piece of hardware, it was necessary to make a lot of different adjustments, add the gearing system, measure the rotation as it was going on, and write the particular software and algorithms that would use data about where the shadow is in position throughout the day to control the rotation and make it change speed over the course of the day. This is a system that can be reproduced and duplicated many times if the need arises.
We used 3 DSLRs for this project, Canon 5D Mark IIIs, and we actually had 3 setups with 3 different lenses. So one was really wide angle, one was a medium angle. Those 2 we had tracking the shadow, and we had one extremely telephoto lens. We actually brought up a 400mm lens with a 2x converter with a 1.6x converter. So that gives us over 1000mm of zoom from the top of the Burj Khalifa. Not ever seeing the sun actually made things a lot easier for us. But I think the most difficult part was during sunrise, when we were trying to point the cameras at the shadows, but we don't know where the shadows are because it's very dusty in the morning, and there's so little contrast that we can't really identify the shadow. So we were pointing our cameras at almost random locations where we thought the shadows would be, but and then it took some time to figure out where the actual bird shadow was. I think the difficult part about this project is making sure that you can see the shadow and also what's outside of the shadow. So if you expose for the shadow, everything else becomes really bright, too bright actually. And if you expose for everything else, then the shadow becomes too dark and you can't see inside the shadow. So we had to be able to find somewhere in between so that we can see both what's inside the shadow and outside of the shadow. For this project we did, I think, 1 photo every 15 seconds throughout the course of maybe 14 hours. So that gives us over 2,000 photos. And each photo is a raw file of over 20 megapixels. So we can really crop into them if we want to. I think our primary goal was to not drop anything. Yeah.
So our project has 2 components, an astronomic component and a cognitive component, and the 2 dovetail and come together in the production of this video, which is meant to be used in classroom demonstrations of the Earth spin. So it becomes a pedagogical project. Mankind has been using shadows for millennia in order to keep track of the time, and this knowledge of timekeeping by the use of shadow was partly explicitly coded in the rules, the complex rules that are used in the construction of sundials, but it was also part of ordinary knowledge. You can see that the shadow gets longer or shorter, and you can see that you're making progress during the day. There are very moments during the year in which you can shoot this type of movie, but given the particular location of the Burj Khalifa of Dubai, that's very close to the tropics, there is only a very small window that's effective for getting the best shadows. So for instance, if you try to shoot during the summer, this is not very useful for our project, because what happens is that the shadow is very long at sunrise, and then it shrinks, comes very close to the tower, and its apparent movement is a small rotation, and then it gets elongated on the opposite side. So it's not going to be a very interesting demonstration. Summer would be nice, on the other hand, because the shadows are much neater. There is much more light and no haze. An ideal temporal window would be between the two, the fall and the spring equinoxes, and the best period is around the solstice, the winter solstice, because then is when the shadows are longer. Climate is not very cooperative in that period. It's not very cooperative because there is haze, a lot of humidity. Sometimes there are also clouds. But the advantage is that the shadow is relatively, the length of the shadow starting from a certain hour tends to be relatively constant. On the other hand, the hazy atmosphere made it possible for us to make a small observation, interesting and intriguing observation. So the Burj Khalifa is a very tall building, and it intercepts light on a height of about 800 meters. And its shadow at sunrise and at sunset, at sunrise, when it was noticed by the team, is projected into the atmosphere. So maybe it's not very visible on the ground, but it is very visible in the atmosphere. I cannot conceive of any other place in the world in which you can get this type of atmospheric shadow from a man-made construction. You can actually notice the shadow from the bottom of the building, from the ground level, when you look up. And it is cast into it looks as if it is cast into the sky, and when you are taking a picture of it, you can see that it is also scaled. There is the setback of a building, its pyramidal structure, that is reproduced in a set of shades of gray of a shadow cast into the sky. Time lapses are cognitively interesting because they shift a certain type of cognitive work from the reasoning system to the visual system. So they make it visible, something that you cannot possibly see by simply looking at something. When you take a set of pictures, you can compare the pictures and see that there are differences in them, and then your reasoning system is activated here. You can say, okay, this was not there, and this is now here. So there is a way for you to detect change, but this complicated way of detecting changes is taken over by the visual system, which has an apparatus, an army of systems, of subsystems that are dedicated to detecting change. And this is why time lapses have been so useful for science, because they allow scientists, observers, to detect patterns which are not visible by the simple comparison of static photographs. And they've been very important in documenting the movement of glaciers, the formation of clouds, tides. So I shot a number of time lapses, and one of them, for instance, is the time lapse of a day at the spring equinox in a snowy part of the world. And I was shooting during the day the apparent movement of shadows around trees. And because of this making visible property of time lapses, I could notice an interesting fact that, to my knowledge, was unnoticed so far. So at the end of the day, shadows appear to climb trees and to quit the earth. It's a minor observation, but science sometimes is just about making minor observations. But this small discovery is made possible by the fact that time lapses are so constructed that you can easily extract abstract information from them.
In the future, we have the idea to take this one step further now and actually either return to with the balcony that we've gone to with a similar rig, or in fact, if everything works out very well, to set up a rig at a higher level on the top of the spire and get the shots that really establish the entire view of Dubai and get the shadow captured with extreme accuracy and contrast.
If we do it again, we could find ways to really bring out the shadows more, and this could partially be done in post-production as well. I think this time we went for more of a overall vibrant look instead of really concentrating on the shadows, but we could place more emphasis on the shadows next time.
The time-lapse of the Burj Khalifa that makes it possible to observe the rotation of the Earth is part of a series of other projects for teaching elementary astronomy that I developed with a number of collaborators. One is the software Astrini. Astrini is a small software that I developed with Glen Lomax that allows you to manipulate a certain number of parameters of the Moon, Earth, Sun configuration. This manipulation is something that astronomic software usually do not allow to do because they want to stick to the truth. But here the idea is to let the user play with a kind of counterfactual astronomy that should enable an understanding of the rules that the Moon, Earth, Sun system follows. So for instance, you can change the tilt of the Earth axis or change the inclination of the Moon orbit relative to ecliptic. The user can play a bit with these parameters, and the idea is that you learn by doing. You act on the solar system in a way in which you can with ordinary astronomic software. Another project developed with Glen Lomax is the software chronogyroscope. The chronogyroscope uses the Earth as its own clock. So when you locate yourself on the Earth, you have a dial that tells you where you are and what time it is at the same time, and it's a way to understand the dependency of time measurement from Earth rotation. So these are high-tech projects in a sense, but I am also interested in developing low-tech projects, and one is the reproduction of an old sundial. It's called the spherical sundial, and it is a globe representing the Earth, which is so situated that if you look at it from outer space and you zoom on it and you zoom out and you look at the Earth, they are exactly in the same position. So by letting it develop during the day, it's not moving, the globe is fixed, it rotates with the Earth. It is possible to follow the pattern of light and shadow exactly as it is on Earth at the same time. All of these projects can be seen and downloaded on our webpage.
I think I've been there 5 times or 6 times already. And I always try to find a pretext to go there again, like, oh, sorry, I forgot to check this. Can I go again? Sorry, oops. And we found at EMAR the most supportive and engaged partners you can dream of in a scientific environment. Basically, they ask us, tell us what we can do to assist you in this project. A project that, if you think about it in terms of safety, yeah, we want to carry equipment on an open terrace, 700 meters above. There are many constraints, but we did it.